The auditor from London said the word thief at 19 minutes past 9 on a June morning, and Susanna Weld watched her father's hands begin to tremble against the long library table. He did not say it loudly. Mr. Josiah Kemp of Chancery Lane said everything in the same flat voice he used for reading figures, and the figure he had just read out was £400. It was the year 1816. The cold, wet summer everyone would remember, and the rain was running down the tall windows of Ashenfield as if the house itself were being questioned. Nobody in the room spoke. And 9 miles east of that library, in a stone cottage at Netherford, where the river ran brown under the willows, a widow of 59 kept a tin box beneath her floorboards that could have ended the whole matter in a quarter of an hour. But no one at the hall knew her name, and the one man who did had just been called a thief, and had chosen, for reasons not even his daughter could imagine, to say nothing at all. Susanna was 26 that summer, and she had stood in that library perhaps 1,000 times, always with the rent book under her arm, always at her father's side. She knew the room as she knew the accounts, completely and without being asked. What she did not know was why Nathaniel Weld, steward of that estate for 31 years, a man who could tell you the price of oak bark in any year since the American War, sat with his swollen hands folded and let a stranger from London lay out the case against him without one word in his own defense. Mr. Kemp turned a page. He was a small, precise man in black, near 60, recommended by a Bristol banker as the most exacting examiner of estate accounts in the west of England, and he had spent the better part of a month in the muniment room earning that reputation. He read it out plainly. Since the winter of 1811, £20 had been drawn from the late baronet's private account upon every quarter day, in cash, against the signature of the steward, marked only for Sir Lewis his private use. Lady Day, Midsummer, Michaelmas, Christmas, £20 at a time, 5 full years of it, 20 separate drawings, £400 entire. And for 5 of those years, Mr. Kemp said, Sir Lewis Vane had been stone blind, confined to 2 rooms and the south terrace, attended day and night, a man who did not gamble, did not travel, did not collect, did not entertain, and could not so much as see a coin held in front of his face. "Show me," said Mr. Kemp, closing the folder, "what a blind man in 2 rooms spends £80 a year upon, in secret, in coin, and I will beg this family's pardon on my knees." There was no answer. Mrs. Amelia Deverell, the late baronet's sister, sat unbending by the cold hearth in her widow's grey and said that there was no answer, that there had never been an answer, and that her brother's household had been bled quietly for years by the one man everybody trusted, which was, she said, always the man who did it. She was 62 years old and respected in 3 counties, and she did not raise her voice either. Sir Roger Marchmont, the magistrate, who had ridden over from the quarter sessions and plainly wished himself anywhere else, asked Nathaniel Weld directly, as a neighbor of 20 years and more, whether he had anything at all to say to the figure. Susanna watched her father lift his head. He looked older than his 63 years, and his voice, when it came, was steady and very quiet. "The money went where it was meant to go," he said. "Beyond that I have nothing to say, and I never will have." That was all. You could hear the rain. Mrs. Deverell rose and said that her family had heard this kind of dignity before, that her own husband had been ruined by a confidential man with exactly this gift for composure, and that she would not watch it happen twice. Sir Roger, unhappy, did what the law and the lady required of him. The steward was suspended from his office. His accounts, his keys, and his papers were sealed, and the formal examination was set for Midsummer Quarter Day, the 24th of June, 10 o'clock in that same library, at which, unless some better account were given of £400, Nathaniel Weld would be committed to the assizes for embezzlement, and everything he had, the cottage, the salary, the good name, everything his daughter lived inside of, would go into the fire with him. Susanna took her father's arm down the wet gravel to the steward's cottage at the end of the beach avenue. The two of them walking through the rain past windows where the servants stood not quite looking, and it was only when the door was shut that she turned to him and begged. She used every argument she had. He only sat down by his own unlit fire, rubbed his ruined knuckles as he always did in wet weather, and said, "Child, I gave my word to a man who cannot release me from it now, and if the price of my word is the assizes, then the assizes will have me." To understand what that word was worth, and what it finally cost, you would have to go back, further back than Susanna herself could go that night, back 40 years to a weir in the dark, and a wager, and a young man who went into the water after his friend. But she knew none of that yet. For her, the story had begun in March, when Sir Louis Vane died in his sleep in his 60th year, and the whole of that ordered world began, very slowly, to tip. Her world was a small one, and she kept it beautifully. The steward's cottage had 6 rooms and stood at the end of the beach avenue, close enough to the hall to hear the stable clock. Her father's salary was £120 a year, with the cottage, coals, and a garden. Her own wage, had anyone ever thought to ask, was nothing at all. Her mother had died when Susanna was 11, and since then the estate office had been her schoolroom, her parlor, and her parish. She was at her desk each morning at 5. She kept the rent book for 44 tenancies, the wage book for 11 indoor servants and 14 outdoor men, the home farm accounts, the timber accounts, the drainage accounts, and the great ruled ledgers that went up to the hall for the baronet's inspection each quarter. And here was the secret that the whole county was about to learn in the worst possible way. For 6 years, not one line of those books had been written by her father's hand. In the hard winter of 1810, the rheumatism had come into Nathaniel's hands and never left, and by the spring his fingers could not close around a pen without the letters staggering like a drunkard. A steward who cannot write is a steward finished, and both of them knew it, and neither of them said it. Instead, without any agreement they could ever remember making, he began to dictate, and she began to write. At first she shaped her letters to look like his old strong hand. Within a year she had stopped pretending, because nobody looked. The figures balanced, the rents came in, the wages went out to the day, and the books of that estate became, though not a soul suspected it, the work of a young woman at a scarred oak desk, writing by lamplight before the housemaids were awake, checking every column twice, because her father had taught her that a ledger is a kind of promise. Whether the old baronet had ever known, she could never afterward decide. Sir Louis in his blindness had grown quiet and strange and gentle, and he had a habit, when the quarter's accounts were read aloud to him, of smiling at some private thing, and saying that the books had never been in better order, and asking after the steward's daughter by name. The new baronet arrived on the last Tuesday of April, and he arrived all wrong. Sir Anthony Vane was the son of Sir Louis's younger brother, a captain of the Royal Navy lately paid off with the peace, 36 years old, and he had not set eyes on the estate since he was a boy of 9. Having spent his whole life since in one wooden world or another. The household expected a carriage, an arrival, a dinner. What they got, though they did not know it for a day and a half, was a tall, weathered man in a plain blue coat who left his horse at the village inn, walked up through the park in the early morning to look at the land with his own eyes before anybody could arrange it for him, and stopped at the open door of the estate office at 7 o'clock because he heard voices inside. Susanna took him for the surveyor expected that week about the drains, and she had no time for him, because old Gideon Hartree was standing in front of her desk twisting his hat, and Gideon Hartree came first. He was 78. He had a cottage and grazing at £7 a year. He had buried a son that winter, and he was £5 5 behind on his rent, which for a man like Hartree was a shame worse than sickness. He had come to give notice and go to his daughter in Frome and be nobody's burden. Susanna did not forgive him the arrears, because it was not her money to forgive, and she did not lecture him, because he was 3 times her age. She opened the rent book, and she showed him his own history in it, 30 years of rent paid to the day. And then she showed him the other things she had already worked out that morning. That the home farm wanted a steady man and a boy for the summer hedging and ditching. That his grandson was 15 and idle for want of a place. And that at the wages offered, the boy's summer would clear the arrears by Michaelmas with 14 shillings over. Then he owes the estate nothing, she said, and the estate keeps a family it has had for 30 years, and the hedges get done by people who care whether they are done well. She wrote the arrangement into the book in her clear, upright hand and gave the old man her father's good morning. Hartree went out past the stranger at the door, straighter than he came in. The man in the blue coat stayed. He asked her one question, which was who had taught her to keep accounts in that fashion, and she said, "My father, sir, and if you are here about the drains, you are 3 days early and will want boots." He said he generally did want boots, thanked her gravely, and walked on up to the hall, and Susanna put him out of her mind until the following evening, when she and her father were summoned to be presented to the new baronet, and the new baronet turned and had the surveyor's weathered face, and something amused and unhurried in his look that she declined, on principle, to be flustered by. Sir Anthony, in those first weeks, did the thing that almost no one in his position does. He asked questions, and then he actually listened to the answers. He rode the estate with Nathaniel and Susanna day after day, learning it as he had learned ships, hull to topmast, and he made no secret of which of the 2 welds carried the detail. It was Susanna who knew that the water meadows wanted their hatches mended before the autumn. Susanna who knew which cottages had sound roofs and which had egg in the walls. Susanna who knew the name of every tenant's wife and most of their children, and when he asked her, on the 3rd ride, what the estate's rental was to the pound, she gave him the figure, £3,840, and then gave him the 4 leaks in it, the 2 farms rack rented under his great-uncle's old agent and never adjusted, the timber contract that undersold the bark, the mill lease that wanted renegotiating at Christmas, and did it all without notes, sitting a plain cob in the rain. He looked at her for a moment across a gate. "Miss Weld," he said, "I have known pursers who could not do that with the ship's books open in front of them, and I have known very few pursers I would say that of." It was not a compliment shaped for a ballroom, and that was precisely why it stayed with her longer than any ballroom thing could have. She was not a woman men looked at twice in an assembly room, and she had settled that account with her mirror years before, without bitterness. But to be seen at her work, seen accurately, as one competent person sees another, that was a thing so rare that she did not quite know where to put it. If the spring had been left alone, it might have gone on growing, unremarked, into whatever it was going to be. The spring was not left alone. Mrs. Deverell had kept her brother's house through all the years of his blindness, and she had done it well, and the arrival of a nephew she barely knew, with his sea manners and his terrifying appetite for questions, unsettled everything she had left. It should be said plainly, because she would come to matter so much, that Amelia Deverell was not a wicked woman. She was a wronged one, and the wrong had happened long ago to somebody else. Her husband had been a Bristol merchant of good credit, and in the year 98 his confidential clerk, a soft-spoken man who had dined at their table every Sunday for 11 years, was found to have been quietly stripping the house for the whole of that time, and was gone to France with the proceeds before the first letter of it was understood. Mr. Deverell's credit failed, and he did not live 2 years after it. His widow came back to her brother's house with her mourning, and one conviction burned into her past all argument, that the trusted man is the dangerous man, precisely because no one is watching him. She had waited 18 years to be proved right about somebody. And so, when the question arose, as it must at any succession, of having the estate's books formally examined before the new baronet took them over, it was Mrs. Deverell who wrote to her banker in Bristol, and the banker who recommended Mr. Josiah Kemp, and Mrs. Deverell who added in her own letter to Mr. Kemp that she wished nothing taken on trust, nothing, however small, and no regard given to the length of anybody's service, since length of service was in her experience merely the length of the opportunity. Mr. Kemp came down the second week of May with 2 clerks and a green portmanteau full of method, and was given the muniment room, and began at the beginning. It is worth saying that Mr. Kemp was an honest man too. He took no pleasure in ruin. He had spent 30 years in the accounts of great estates, he had seen every trick that can be done with a ledger, and he worked the way weather works, without malice and without mercy. For the first fortnight he found what he privately admitted he had never once found in 30 years, which was nothing. Rents entered to the shilling, wages to the day, timber, tithes, drainage, repairs, every column crossing to its fellow, year into year, decade into decade, a chain of figures you could hang an anchor from. He said as much, grudgingly, to his clerks. Then, in the 3rd week of May, he found the 2 things he could not reconcile, and the first was small and strange, and the second was 400 pounds. The small strange thing was handwriting. Mr. Kemp had spent enough years with ledgers to read a hand the way a farrier reads a hoof, and somewhere in the volumes for 1810 the steward's writing changed. Not overnight, and not carelessly. It softened, steadied, grew rounder in the loops and surer in the figures, and by 1811 it was, to an eye like his, another person entirely, keeping the books over the same signature. He said nothing for 2 days while he satisfied himself, comparing letters in the correspondence files, and then he brought it to Mrs. Deverell and the new baronet together, laid 2 pages side by side, and asked the simple question: who has actually been keeping these books, and why has the fact been hidden? Susanna was sent for. She came in with ink on her middle finger, saw the 2 open volumes turn to face her like an accusation, and understood at once that 6 years of quiet had just ended. She did not attempt a single evasion, and she was never afterward sorry for that, whatever else it cost. She said, "I write the books. I have written them since the winter of 1810, when the rheumatism took my father's hands. He dictates, he checks, every judgment in them is his, but the pen is mine. We told no one, because a steward who cannot hold a pen is a steward dismissed, and he had given this estate 25 years at that time, and I would do it again tomorrow." There was a silence with several different weathers in it. Sir Anthony had not taken his eyes from her, and if she had been less frightened she might have read that look correctly. Mr. Kemp merely made a note, because to him a fact was a fact. But to Mrs. Deverell the room had gone dark, and it must be understood why. Here was the trusted man again. Here again were the quiet ears, the respectable face, and underneath them a concealment, running on and on while nobody watched, and this time with a new feature that offended her past bearing, that the estate of her family, the rents of 44 tenancies, the whole written truth of the land she had been born on, had been for 6 years in the hands of a girl, unpaid, unappointed, unknown to anyone with a right to decide. What else, she asked, in a voice like the first crack in ice, has been quietly arranged in that office without our knowledge? And Mr. Kemp, because it was his duty, answered her. That was the day the drawings came out. £20 on every quarter day since Lady Day 1811, in coin, against the steward's signature, marked for Sir Lewis his private use, and no voucher, no receipt, no letter, no entry in any book at the hall to say where 1 shilling of it had gone. 20 drawings. £400. And the man they were drawn for blind in 2 rooms the whole while, with an establishment that bought his every comfort openly through the house accounts. Mr. Kemp had checked the private account backward as well, and found the same £20 a quarter going back year upon year into the last century, but before 1811 Sir Lewis had drawn it with his own hand, and a gentleman may do as he pleases with his own money while he can see to count it. It was the 6 years of a blind man's signature by proxy that could not stand. A steward with sole control of the drawings, a concealed hand in the books, and £400 in cash gone into the air. Mrs. Deverell heard it all with her hands folded, and what she felt, to be fair to her even here, was not triumph. It was the old wound-tearing, and a terrible relief that this time, at least, she had caught it before it killed anybody. Which brings the story back to where it began. The library, the rain, the 24th of June appointed, and Nathaniel Weld saying, in that level voice, the money went where it was meant to go, and refusing, then and after, to add 1 syllable to it. He was not taken to the lockup. Sir Roger Marchmont had no appetite for chaining a man of 63 with 40 years of good repute, and Sir Anthony went surety for his appearance without being asked twice. But he was suspended, his keys were taken, seals were put on the office boxes, and he was to keep to the cottage until midsummer, which he did, growing more silent every day, while the worst June in living memory rained the county's hay into black rot, and the estate went leaderless into it. For it did not stop raining. That was the summer the sun seemed to have gone out of England, when frost came in June like a visitation, and the wheat stood green and flattened in the water, and every tenant on the books was watching the sky and doing sums in his head and being afraid. 44 tenancies needed answers about seed corn, about abatements, about the hatches on the flooded meadows, and the man who had held all those threads for 31 years was forbidden his own office. So his daughter took it. Not by right, for she had none. She simply continued, because the alternative was ruin for people whose names she had been writing since she was 15. She was at her desk before first light, as always. She answered what she could answer, held what she could hold, and sent up to the hall each evening a fair copy of everything she had done, so that no one could ever again say the word concealment. Mrs. Deverell declared it intolerable, the accused man's daughter sitting in the accused man's chair, and wanted a new steward down from London within the fortnight. Sir Anthony refused. He said that a ship taking water does not dismiss the one officer who knows the pumps, that every line the girl wrote went before his eyes the same evening, and that if the family truly believed order was a mask for theft, they were free to find him one thief in England who copied her own doings to her accusers daily. It was the first time anyone had heard him take a side, and the house divided over it, as houses do, the kitchen and the stables and the tenantry on one side, and the drawing room on the other. Susanna herself would not let him defend her twice. She thanked him at the office door, once, formally, and told him it would be better for the estate and for him if he kept the length of the avenue between them until Midsummer had spoken. He looked at her for a moment. "You are protecting me now," he said. "It is an odd arrangement, Miss Weld. Everyone in this story seems to be protecting somebody, and the total effect is that an innocent man is going to the assizes." Then he wished her good morning and kept scrupulously the length of the avenue between them, and she discovered that a person can be obeyed and missed in the same hour. It was in those weeks, turning her father's cottage upside down at night for anything that might speak for him, since he would not speak for himself, that she found the pocketbook. It was in the drawer of his old desk, not hidden at all. A shabby black memorandum book going back years, full of the small notes a steward makes against forgetting. Farrier Tuesday. Hartree's boy to start Monday. Lime for the long field. And there, against every quarter, going back through page after page after page, always in the same place at the foot of the entry, 2 letters and 1 word. J.S. paid, Lady Day, J.S. paid, Midsummer, J.S. paid, Michaelmas Christmas year upon year, J.S. paid, J.S. paid, and once, only once, in the cramped writing of his ruined years, 4 words that were different, J.S. the Weir. She sat with the book open under the candle until the clock struck 2, and she understood exactly nothing, except that her father's secret had initials, and that he had been paying it, whatever it was, with the faithfulness of a man paying a debt he never once resented. She asked her father about the pocketbook the next morning. She put it open on the table between them, laid her finger on the letters, and asked, gently, "Who is J.S.?" Nathaniel looked at it for a long time, and then he closed the book and slid it back to her and said, "That book does no harm and no good, and you may burn it or keep it. But you will not follow it, Susanna. There are only 2 people alive who may open that door, and I am not either of them." It was the longest answer he had given anyone in days, and it was also, though neither of them knew it, very nearly true. She did not burn it. She carried it back to the office and locked it in her own desk, and then, because she could not follow the initials, she followed the other word. The Weir. She walked to the vicarage on the first dry evening of the month and asked Mr. Penrose, who had held the living for a dozen years and loved the parish registers better than most men love their gardens, whether he knew of any Weir that had mattered ever in the history of the family. Mr. Penrose was a mild, exact little man, and he thought about it with his eyes shut. There was no Weir on the estate itself, he said. The nearest Weir of any account was away east on the river at Netherford, 9 miles past the turnpike. Not their parish at all. He had it in his head, though he could not say from where, that there had been a drowning at the Netherford Weir a great many years ago. Long before his time, some young man got into the mill race when the river was up. But Netherford's registers were Netherford's, and its dead belonged to another man's church, and with the roads as the rains had left them, 9 miles might as well have been 90 with Midsummer coming on like a tide. Susanna wrote the word Netherford in her own pocketbook and could do nothing more with it, and it sat there like a stone. If you have come this far with Susanna, and you want to know what those 2 letters cost her father, and why the answer to them came to the hall on foot, in the rain, in a tin box, take a moment now and subscribe, because the second half of this story is the reason the first half hurts, and you will want to be in the room when that door opens. Meanwhile, Mr. Kemp was completing his work, and Mr. Kemp had a difficulty he had not confessed to anyone, which was that outside the £400, The books in front of him were the finest he had ever examined, and the concealed hand that had written them was the reason why, and the two facts sat in his professional conscience like grit in an oyster. In the second week of June he sent for Miss Weld to the muniment room, on a pretext he did not much trouble to disguise. He had found, he said, an error of £22 in the timber account for 1814. Money entered above the sale price of the fall, and invented income in a book was to him the blackest mark there was, worse than money missing, and he wished to hear her account of it before he wrote it down. He watched her for the flicker, for the pause, as examiners do. She did not pause. The oak fall of 1814, she said, was 1 in 40 trees sold standing to the Bristol yard for £308, and if he had found £22 above it, he had found the bark. The bark of a felled oak, she said, is stripped and sold separately to the tanners. It is the steward's business to sell it well, and it was sold that spring to the tannery at Marl for £22, entered under the timber head where it belongs, because it grew on the same trees, and the tanner's note of hand would be found in the third drawer of the office, in the bundle for that year, folded inside the yard's receipt, where her father always filed the two together, timber and bark, tree and skin. Mr. Kemp went down to the office himself, before dinner, alone. He opened the third drawer, found the bundle, unfolded the yard's receipt, and inside it, folded exactly as she had said 5 years untouched, lay the tanner's note for £22. He stood in the low doorway of that office for some minutes with the two papers in his hand, looking at the desk, at the inkstand, at the neat shelved years of the estate's whole remembered life. And if you had been able to see into so dry a man, you would have seen the first hairline crack running through 5 weeks of certainty. A hand that invents income does not file the proof of its honesty where any examiner may find it. He wrote in his private notes that night one sentence that would matter later. The discrepancy of £22 is resolved, and the resolution reflects credit on the keeping of these books. But £400 is £400, and his duty was arithmetic, not sentiment, and the arithmetic still ended in a hole with a suspended steward standing over it. Mrs. Deverell, in those same weeks, fought her own engagement on a second front, which was the new baronet's eyes. She had watched him watching the steward's daughter, and she liked none of it. And being a woman who did things to people's faces, she chose an afternoon when the rain had penned them both into the morning room and said what she had to say. "You believe I am cruel," she told him. "I am the only person in this house old enough to be kind. I have seen this exact play before, the modest manner, the wonderful competence, the man of family drawn in until he cannot tell his judgment from his affections, and I saw how it ends, with my husband dead of a broken bank and a soft-spoken clerk drinking his wine in Boulogne. That girl's father has taken £400 of this family's money, and the girl herself hid her hand in our books for 6 years, and you propose to trust the pair of them because the books are tidy and her eyes are steady. Tidy books, sir, are what the crime looks like." Sir Anthony heard her out, which few people did, all the way to the end. Then he told her, without heat, that he had served 23 years in a service where men were hanged on evidence, and he had learned to know the difference between a fact and a fear, and everything she had just said was fear wearing the fact's uniform. But he would make her one promise, because she was his aunt, and had loved his uncle, and had earned it. There would be no quiet arrangement, no hushing, no settling the thing privately in the family shadow. The examination at midsummer would go forward in the open, before the magistrate, before the household, before any tenant who chose to stand at the back of the room, and whatever it found would be said aloud where the whole county could hear it. If the Welds were guilty, they would fall publicly. And if they were innocent, then every person who had doubted them would say so publicly. In that room, himself included and herself not excepted. Mrs. Deverell said that she asked for nothing better, and believed it. On the 20th of June, a note came down the avenue to the office, addressed in a strong, plain hand Susanna did not know, and it contained nothing improper, being 3 lines about the mended hatches on the west meadows and a request for the seed corn figures against the autumn. And then, below the signature, 1 line more, which she read perhaps 30 times before midsummer. Whatever the day brings, it said, the fair copies come up in your hand every evening, and I would take that hand's word against a room full of columns. She did not answer it, and she kept it, and the 2 facts belonged to the same feeling. News, meanwhile, was doing what news does in a wet county with little else to talk about. The carrier's cart went out from the village every Wednesday and Saturday, and it carried more than parcels, and by the middle of June there was not a market within 15 miles where they were not saying that the steward up at the great house had been taken in 400 pounds of his master's money, the quiet one welled 30 years there, which only shows you. And on the Saturday before midsummer the story was told, among 100 other places, at a stall in Netherford, 9 miles east, within the hearing of a straight-backed old woman in a gray cloak who had walked in for thread and a 1/4 pound of tea, and who set down her basket and asked the teller, in a voice that made him stand up properly, to say the steward's name again. He said it. She paid for her tea with steady hands, and walked home along the river, past the willows, past the weir with the water roaring brown over it, and went into her cottage and shut the door. And what she did in there, and what she took up from under the floor, belongs a little further on in this story. At the hall, the last days ran out quickly. Nathaniel had grown thinner and stiller inside his silence, like a man conserving himself for one effort, and on the evening of the 23rd Susanna sat with him while the rain came back against the windows, and tried one final time. She told him about the pocketbook which he knew, and about Netherford which he did not, and she watched something move behind his eyes when she said the word, and pressed it. "Papa," she said, "I know there was a weir, and I know there was a drowning in it, and I know your whole trouble has initials, and tomorrow at 10 o'clock they will take your good name, and then they will take mine, and I can carry anything except carrying it ignorant." And Nathaniel Weld looked at his daughter for a long moment, and for the only time in the whole of that terrible month he very nearly told her. She saw him come to the very lip of it. Then he said, "Child, 40 years ago a better man than I am carried a thing alone, so that no one else would ever have to, and I was given my one small corner of it to hold, and I gave my word, and my word does not have a clause in it for assizes. If tomorrow goes against me, you will sell nothing, you will beg nothing, you will go to my sister at Taunton, and you will keep the books of your own life as straight as you have kept mine. Now go to your bed, for one of us should sleep, and it had better be the one who still has work in the morning." She did not sleep. Long before the house stirred, she was at the office desk out of pure habit, writing the fair copy of the day before, because it was the last morning anyone might let her do it, and the lamplight on the ruled lines was the only steady thing in the world. Midsummer day came in gray and cold, with the roads a churn of mud, and by 10 o'clock the library at Ashenfield held more people than it had held since the old baronet's funeral. Sir Roger Marchmont at the long table with his clerk beside him and the committal papers drawn and waiting under his hand. Mr. Kemp with his folders squared. Mrs. Deverell by the hearth in gray, upright as a pew end. Sir Anthony standing at the window with his hands behind his back like a man on his own quarterdeck in weather. Miss Penrose near the door. "Come," he said simply, because a parishioner was in trouble. And at the back, standing, because Sir Anthony had kept his word about the open doors, a dark wet row of them, Hartrey and his grandson, the miller, the smith, Mrs. Tolliver the housekeeper with her apron changed for black, men from the home farm turning their hats in their hands, the silent jury a parish keeps for its own. Nathaniel sat in the middle of the room in his good coat, his stiff hands quiet in his lap, and Susanna sat beside him, and the rain ticked on the glass. Mr. Kemp laid the case out for the record, and it took him 40 minutes, and he was fair, which made it worse. The unbroken excellence of the books. The change of hand in 1810 concealed 6 years. The private drawings, £20 each quarter day from Lady Day 1811 to Christmas 1815. 20 drawings, £400 in coin against the steward's sole signature for the private use of a blind man who had no private uses, with no voucher, no receipt, and no explanation offered then or since. He closed the folder and said that figures could not lie, but men could decline to speak. And this man had so declined, and arithmetic left one hole of £400 and one man standing at the edge of it. Sir Roger asked Nathaniel, formally and for the last time, whether he would give any account of the money. Nathaniel said, "The money went where it was meant to go. All of it, to the last shilling, and it was the best money this estate ever spent, and I will say nothing more." A sound went through the back of the room, half grief, half pride. Sir Roger looked at his own hands and then at the committal papers and asked whether anyone in the room had anything to say that touched the matter, because if not, his duty was written in front of him and he would do it. Susanna stood up. She had not planned the words, and she did not need to. She said, "Sir, I have kept this estate's books for 6 years, and my father for 25 before that, and you have had the finest examiner in the west of England inside them for 6 weeks, and I ask you to weigh the one thing he has told you against the one thing he has not explained. If my father were a thief, you would never have found it. You would have found a receipt in a dead man's name, a forged voucher, a false head in the accounts, because the man who taught me could have hidden £400 from Mr. Kemp himself, and Mr. Kemp knows it. Instead, you found it in one morning, because he wrote it down, £20 by £20, plainly, over his own signature, quarter by quarter, in a book he knew would one day be read. Gentlemen, that is not how a man steals. That is how a man obeys." Mr. Kemp looked up from his folder for the first time and did not look down again. But Mrs. Deverell rose from her place by the hearth and said, in the level voice that carried further than shouting, that obedience without a master was a story and not a defense, that her own family had been ruined once before by exactly this arithmetic of trust, and that if the money truly went where it was meant to go, there was one question with no answer in the room. "Meant by whom, Miss Weld? Show me the mouth that gave the order, or the hand that took the coin, for the one is in his grave, and the other, it seems, is nowhere on this earth." And it was into that silence, at 17 minutes past 11 by the library clock, that Mrs. Tolliver came through the tall doors without knocking, water still on her cap, and said, begging Sir Roger's pardon, "But there is a woman at the front of the house who has walked from Netherford since before it was light, and she will not come round to the kitchen, and she will not go away, and she says she is the answer. She came in leaning on nothing. She was 59 years old, and she had walked 9 miles of flooded lanes since 4 in the morning, and her boots and the hem of her gray cloak were one color with the mud, and she stood in the doorway of that library like a plumb line, taking the measure of the room until she found Nathaniel in the middle of it. She said, "Mr. Weld, 40 years, and we meet in a room." And Nathaniel Weld came up out of his chair as a younger man stands for the crown, and said nothing, but his face had opened like a window. And Susanna, watching, understood that whoever this woman was, her father had just been released from something. Sir Roger asked the woman her name and business. She sat down on the long table. In front of them all, a small japanned tin box, rust at the corners, and she said, "My name is Jane Sparrow, widow of Samuel Sparrow of Netherford, and my business is £20 a quarter." And she looked around the room without hurry and added, "Truth keeps its own books, sir, and it never misses a quarter day." Then she told them, standing, refusing the chair twice, in the plain voice of a woman who had rehearsed nothing because she had lived it. On the 16th of June, 1776, she said, there was a fair at Netherford, and after it, in the dark with the river running high, a party of young gentlemen made a wager. And one of them, being 20 years old, and full of wine, and the certainty of young gentlemen, took a punt out above the weir to shoot it for 5 guineas. The punt went over, and turned under him. And her Samuel, the ferryman's son, 21 years old and 11 weeks her husband, who knew that water better than any man living and feared it more, went off the bank in his shirt because someone was drowning. And he got the young gentleman to the sill of the weir where other hands could reach him. And then the race took Samuel under the gates, and they brought him to her the next morning on a hurdle. The young gentleman's name, she said, was Mr. Lewis Vane. His father was a great man in the county, and the inquest heard about the fair and the flood and nothing about the wager, and the verdict was misadventure, and no gentleman's name was ever spoken in it. That, she said, is how it was done in those days, and I was 19, and I hated them all. Then one evening a week after the burying, a young man came alone up the river path to my door, and stood in my kitchen, and tried 3 times to say his own name, and could not for weeping. He did not offer me money that first time. He asked me to tell him what Samuel had been like as a boy, and he stayed 2 hours, and when he went he said, "I will not insult you with a purse, but I am going to owe you a debt for the rest of my life, and I mean to pay it as long as we both live." And from Michaelmas of that year to Christmas last past, she said, that man never missed. 4 times a year, first from his own allowance, brought on his own horse, in his own hand, 40 years, through his marriage and my mourning, through the wars, through everything. When his eyes began to fail him, he rode to me one last time. In January of 1811, an old man led on a quiet mare, and he sat where he had sat when he was 20, and he put a letter into my hands and said, "Jane, I cannot come again, but I am sending you the only man alive I would trust with this, and if any man ever calls him to account for it when I am gone, you are to carry this letter to whoever asks, and let it speak, for it will say what I could never say aloud in my own county." She looked at the magistrate. "It is asking now, I think," she said, and she opened the tin box. Inside, tied in ribbon gone the color of tea, were 40 years of small folded notes, each one no bigger than a tradesman's bill, and Sir Roger opened 3 at random and read them to the room. Michaelmas, with my remembrance, L.V. for the roof, and my remembrance, L.V., Christmas, and God keep you, L.V., and beneath the notes, sealed still, one letter which Jane Sparrow put into the magistrate's hands, and which Sir Roger Marchmont, 21 years a justice, opened and read aloud in a room so quiet you could hear the fire settle, in a hand grown vast and wandering, the writing of a man shaping letters by the memory of shaping them. to whoever calls my steward to account. Nathaniel Weld has done nothing these 5 years but obey me. On every quarter day he has drawn 20 pounds from my private account, by my order, given him in writing in January 1811, in a letter I required him to read once and burn in front of me, and carry the sum himself to Mrs. Jane Sparrow, widow of Samuel Sparrow, ferryman's son, of Netherford, and to speak of it to no living soul while there was breath in me, and after, only if honor itself should require it. I bound him so, because the debt is mine and the shame is mine, and I would not have my shame become his burden, nor her bread become gossip. On the 16th of June, 1776, Samuel Sparrow went into the water at the Netherford Weir for a drunken wager that was mine, and gave me back my life, and lost his own, and was 21. What I owed could not be paid. What could be paid, I have paid, and my steward after me, at 20 pounds upon each quarter day, and if any man finds that money ill spent, let him answer for it to God, for I could not spend it better. Louis Vane. Written by my own hand while it can still make letters, the 9th of January, 1811. Sir Roger laid the letter down as if it were made of glass, and it was Sir Anthony who moved first. He took from his waistcoat the watch that had come to him with his uncle's seals, and worked off the ring of it a small brass key that he had carried unknowing since April, and crossed to the old writing desk that stood between the library windows, the dead man's own, sealed since March, and Sir Roger nodded, and the key turned, and the drawer gave up a red morocco memorandum book. It was the private account, kept in Sir Lewis's own hand across 4 decades, and it said the same thing several hundred times. J.S. 20 pounds, J.S. 20 pounds, quarter upon quarter, year upon year, back and back to Michaelmas 1776, and at the January of 1811, in the last entry the blind man ever made, sprawled huge across a whole page. Weld must be my eyes now. He is the only man alive I would trust with my shame. After that the pages were blank. Mr. Kemp asked leave to speak, and asked Mrs. Sparrow one question, the examiner in him faithful to the last. The payment since the baronet's death, he said. Sir Lewis died in March. No sum was drawn from any account of this estate after the 3rd of March. I will stake my name on it. Yet Lady Day fell 3 weeks after. Madam, did the money come at Lady Day? And Jane Sparrow said, it came. To the day as it always came, and every head in the room turned to Nathaniel Weld, who stood with his hands folded, and said simply, from my own wage. There was no other honest drawer to take it from, and I did not think Sir Lewis would wish her to wait upon the lawyers. I have been paid 120 pounds a year by this family for 31 years. And that quarter I judged the estate owed a debt senior to my salary, and if that was a liberty, I am ready to answer for it. It was Mr. Kemp who broke first, and those who were there said afterward it was the strangest and somehow the finest of all of it. The little dry man in black rising with his folder shut and saying for the record, and he wished his exact words taken down. I have examined the accounts of great estates for 30 years, and I came into this house engaged to find a thief, and I found instead the most faithful set of books it has ever been my duty to open, kept latterly, to this county's shame and by nobody's leave, by a young woman at 5 o'clock in the morning without 1 shilling of wage. The 400 pounds is accounted to the last farthing. The discrepancy was never in the books. The discrepancy was in us. I was wrong, and I am glad of it, and in 30 years I have never once said either sentence. Sir Roger Marchmont stood, took up the committal papers that had lain drawn and ready under his hand all morning, and tore them across, and tore them again, and said that his clerk would enter instead, that the examination had found the steward of Ashenfield not merely innocent, but honorable, past the reach of the word, and that he, Roger Marchmont, having known Nathaniel Weld these 20 years, begged his pardon for the last month before every soul in this room, and would tell this story at every quarter sessions in the county until they tired of him. From the back, where the wet row of them stood, old Hartree said, not loudly, that they'd none of them tire of it, and the room laughed and wept its relief at last, and Mr. Penrose blew his nose like a trumpet, and said the register at Netherford should have a stone to go with it. And then the room went quiet again, because Mrs. Amelia Deverell had risen from her place by the hearth. She stood a moment, very straight, an old woman gathering the whole of her pride in both hands in order to lay it down, and she crossed the library floor to Nathaniel Weld, and did not offer him her hand, but stood before him, as one stands before a judge. I said in this house, she said, that tidy books are what the crime looks like. I said that the trusted man is the dangerous man. I have said such things for 18 years, because a trusted man once broke my husband, and I have made every honest man since pay interest on that villain's debt. You are not him. You never were, and a wiser woman would have seen it in a week. Mr. Weld, I accused you in front of your daughter and your neighbors, and I am wrong in every particular, and I ask your pardon in front of the same. And she turned to Susanna, and her voice, for the first time in anyone's memory, was not level. As for you, child, I called your 6 years of service a concealment. I have kept this family's house for 20 years, and I know now that you and your father were keeping the family, and it kept you on nothing, and mocked you with it, and you never once broke. If you can be kinder to a proud old woman than she was to you, come and pour my tea on Sunday, and we will begin again. Susanna went to her, and took both her hands, and the two of them said nothing at all, which everyone present agreed was the most eloquent thing said that day. Sir Anthony ended it, and he did it from the middle of the room, before the magistrate and the tenants and his aunt and God and everybody, because he had learned one thing in that library above all the rest, which is what silence costs, and he would not pay it. He said, Mr. Weld, your keys will be brought back to your office this afternoon, and the office is yours until you tire of it, and your salary is £160 from Lady Day last, and this estate will hear no more on the subject. And then he turned to where Susanna stood. Miss Weld, he said, I came home in April believing I had inherited a house, and I find I have inherited a debt of honor, and I mean to keep it paid, and that is a state business and could have waited. What cannot wait is this. I have watched you these 2 months hold this place upright with both hands while it called your father thief, and I have taken your word against a room full of columns since the second morning I knew you. And I am asking you now, before the people who doubted you and the two who never did, to do me the honor of becoming my wife, not to raise you up, for you were never low, but because a man should sail with the best navigator he can find, and I have found her. She looked at him for what felt to every witness there a very long time, though the library clock called it 4 seconds. And then Susanna Weld, who had not wept at the accusation, nor at the letter, nor at the tearing of the committal, said, You will want it in writing, sir, I suppose, like everything else in this house, and gave him her hand, and wept at last, and the row at the back of the room forgot itself entirely, and cheered. What became of them all is quickly told, and deserves the telling. Mr. Kemp went back to London a week after midsummer, and went back changed, for he wrote from Chancery Lane to accept the post of the estate's London agent at half his usual terms, on the sole condition that he be permitted to send down 2 young clerks every autumn to study what he called. In the letter Susanna kept, "The Weld books, the only accounts in England," he wrote, "that ever made an honest man of an auditor." Sir Roger Marchmont was as good as his word, and told the story at the quarter sessions and the assize dinners and anywhere else the county sat still long enough, for so many years that in time the young lawyers believed he had invented it. Mrs. Deverell took the waters at Bath that autumn, as she always did, and came back before Christmas, which she never did, and the Sunday tea she had asked of Susanna became a fixed institution of both their lives, guarded by the 2 of them with a jealousy that amused the whole house. They were married in September in the parish church, with little ceremony, the tenantry filling every pew and standing 2 deep at the back. Nathaniel gave his daughter away with his poor stiff hands, and it was remarked by everybody that beside the bride, in the front pew, in a new gray cloak that had never seen mud, sat Mrs. Jane Sparrow of Netherford, and beside her, unbending as ever, Mrs. Amelia Deverell, and the 2 widows shared a hymn book. A year on, at midsummer of 1817, the son came back to England, and the hay went up sweet, and if you had opened the great ledger of that estate to the quarters page, you would have found, entered openly at last in a clear, upright hand, the line that 40 years of honor had waited for. To Mrs. Jane Sparrow of Netherford, by right of an old debt, £20, and beneath it, in the same hand, the annuity confirmed to her for life under the new baronet's seal. She dined at the hall at each quarter's end after, at her own place at the table, and at Netherford, above the weir, there stands to this day a plain stone that Sir Anthony and Nathaniel raised together, cut with the words, "Samuel Sparrow, ferryman's son, who went into the water for another man's life." The debt is remembered. Nathaniel kept his office 2 years more, and then kept the cottage, the garden, and his full salary for the rest of his days, on his son-in-law's flat orders, though he still walked up the avenue most mornings to sit by the office fire and be consulted, which was the part he had never once been paid for and valued above the whole. And the new ledger for 1817 carried on its first page, for the first time in 7 years, the true name of its keeper, Susanna, Lady Vane, who was at her desk at 5 most mornings all her long life, not because anyone required it, but because her father had taught her that a ledger is a kind of promise, and she had promises to keep. If you have sat with Susanna through this long, cold June, thank you for keeping her company to the end, and before you go, be part of this room. Tell us in the comments which of them stays with you tonight, Nathaniel and his 40 years of silence, Susanna and her steady columns of ink, or Jane Sparrow and her 9 miles of flooded lane, for every answer here becomes part of the story's own guest book. Tell us, too, what county or country you are listening from, for these stories have found their way to porches and firesides a long way from Somerset, and we read every line. And come back Sunday, for the next story is waiting, of a governess in Kent turned out into the snow for a theft she never committed, until a child's sampler, stitched in silence, spelled out the truth her employers could not bear to hear. But we will not end on business. We will end where Susanna would wish it, at the estate office on a dry June evening, the lamp lit early out of pure habit, an old man asleep in the chair by the fire, the rent book open to a clean page for tomorrow, and the rain at long last gone from the glass.